How many of you love God's word? How many of you love Leviticus? You're a real Bible geek. Well, we're supposed to love God's word. We're supposed to love all of it, but there's some parts of it with which we're more familiar on average than others. For example, we may be familiar with the Sermon on the Mount or with Paul's letter to the Romans or the stories of David and Goliath and so on. But what about when the psalmist says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day." Or when the psalmist says in Psalm 1 that he meditates on God's law day and night, just as Joshua was instructed to do. Or what about when Deuteronomy describes the law? What if a nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? Now, when we speak of the Torah or the law or God's instruction, in a broader sense, it's sometimes used for the whole of the law and the prophets. In the narrower sense, it's used for the Pentateuch, first 5 books of Moses. So Genesis, stories of Abraham, and so on. But in the narrowest sense, what we're talking about this time, we're talking about the laws specifically. Now, different cultures have different laws. Most of them have something in common, like you shall not kill. At least you shall not kill, except maybe your nation's enemies, depending on what culture it is. But, there are different civil laws, like stop when you see an octagonal red sign. It says stop on it. That's in my culture, and maybe a few others. So there are some things that are civil laws, and we're going to be looking mostly at the civil laws of Israel today. Now, having said that there's no other nation with such great laws, keep in mind he's addressing a particular culture, particular setting. So Jesus says, Moses said that to you because of the hardness of your hearts. In other words, don't extrapolate all your ethics from these laws. God's standard may be actually higher. Even the Pharisees said that. They talked about building a fence around the law to make sure you don't violate its intention. So, but what we're going to be looking at now is what the law is actually addressed in their setting. And we're going to look at some of the ancient Near Eastern setting of these laws. Some of them you'll say, wow, the Lord God, Jesus teaches us better than that now. Or the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on, teach us better than that now. And that's true, but it was the best they had at that time, and it was something God was speaking to them in their context, so they could get along in their culture at that time. Comparing Israel's laws with those of her neighbors, you have common legal categories, like what if your ox gores a neighbor's ox? That's not usually something we talk about in our laws today, but we do think about property liability, about safety liability, things like that in laws today. So there are some interesting principles we can look at, but we have to know how to extrapolate them, which will be in the next session. But in this one, just comparing common legal categories, certain things that ancient Near Eastern legal collections were supposed to cover, and then some differences in ethics. And those differences will show us where Israel goes beyond those of her neighbors. Some laws, right from the start, go beyond the neighbors. The Ten Commandments don't have any exact parallel anywhere else in Israel's context. The closest thing you've got to them is the Egyptian negative confessions. I never killed anybody, and so on. But those aren't really close. Not only are there not just 10 of them, there are quite a lot more. But some of them are things like, I have never eaten human dung. Congratulations. Another contrast is social rank. This is something that differs very much from the surrounding cultures. All other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean laws were class-based in terms of their penalties. You do something to somebody of higher social class, you're in big trouble. Same social class, you get a penalty commensurate with your action. Lower social class, you might get a lesser fine. Israel is the only known ancient Near Eastern legal collection that refuses to take class into account. But there are also parallels, like something done to a servant's ear. Both cultures, say the Code of Hammurabi, really a legal collection of Hammurabi, and Exodus deal with debt slavery. Now, again, this is where I'm talking about where there are places where these aren't the ideal, these aren't God's ideal, but they're moving either beyond the culture or beyond what the culture would be like if there were no restraints on it. So it's an improvement. Redeeming property in terms of redeeming somebody from debt slavery or redeeming something else from slavery, or from redeeming something else that you owe. Slaves' children may not get the inheritance of the slaveholder, although sometimes they can if the slaveholder says that. But anyway, the practice of the dowry and other marital arrangements, you've got that as part of ancient Near Eastern legal collections. Now, in some cultures, what you have is a bride price. It's a way of kind of thanking the bride's family for investing in her, even though in that culture she's going to become part of another family. So my wife is from Africa. I did need to pay something. I assure you my wife is worth way more than that, but I didn't have a lot of money. Somebody told me that her father wouldn't even speak to me unless I could come up with 50 cows. I don't own any cows, but my God owns the cows on 1,000 hills. Anyway, but yes, the practice of the dowry and other marital arrangements. In many cultures, it's the father who invests in the daughter, giving the dowry. So if something happens to the husband, this is like to support her, whatever. Intention matters. Now, this is still true in law today, and at least should be a matter in law today. So there's a difference between murder and killing somebody accidentally. So if you're driving too fast and you kill somebody, that's really bad. If you're driving not too fast and somebody runs out in front of you, that's really bad, but you put your brakes on, it wasn't enough. If you kill somebody on purpose, that's really, really bad. And so you have that in both kinds of legal collections. I'm looking especially at Hammurabi because that's the one that's best known, but you've also got Lipit Ishtar, Eshnunna, and other legal collections from the ancient Near Eastern world. Penalties for striking parents, you've got that. In Hammurabi, it's actually stricter in Exodus. So if you strike your father in the Code of Hammurabi, they cut off your hand. If you do that in Israel, you're to be put to death with your father or your mother. And so also if you curse them. Penalties for kidnapping. So it does show you God's very serious about those kind of offenses. Penalties for kidnapping. Now, this was, people could be enslaved in the ancient Near East as war captives. They could be enslaved as debt captives, but there was also kidnapping. And the penalty for that, in the case of both Hammurabi and Exodus, was death. Now, interestingly, we're going to see that the law of Moses is actually stricter than other ancient Near Eastern legal collections when it comes to certain things about slavery. Like if a slave escapes, Code of Hammurabi, if you harbor the escaped slave, you're to be killed. In Deuteronomy, you're supposed to harbor the slave. Don't return the slave to the slaveholder. Compensation for injuries caused. Well, you've got that in Hammurabi. You also have that in Exodus. Laws economically value free persons more than slaves. Again, we're going to have to talk about well, how to interpret the laws and how we should apply them. But laws economically valued free persons more than slaves. Eshnunna, interestingly, If you kill another slave, you make a monetary payment. If you kill their wife or child, then you can be put to death. In Exodus, if somebody beats a male or female slave, their own, and the slave dies, the beater must be punished. But if the slave gets up after a day or two, well, not then. That's also true for the free persons. But here we're just looking at the parallels. Penalties for accidentally killing a fetus. You have that in both cultures. Higher penalty also if the wife dies. You have that in both cultures. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Eyebrow for an eyebrow, doesn't say that. Anyway, Code of Hammurabi. If you destroy the eye of a member of the aristocracy, they destroy your eye. You break an aristocrat's bone, they break your bone. If an aristocrat has knocked out the tooth of an aristocrat of his own rank, they'll knock out his tooth. But if it's somebody of lesser rank, less is done to them. Well, in Exodus, if there's serious injury, you take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, and so on. Everybody of equal worth, so long as they're free. That's a distinction we're going to, again, come back to. Laws concerning slaves' injuries. Well, in Hammurabi, if they destroy the eye of an aristocrat's slave or break their bone, they need to pay the slaveholder 1/2 the value, so the slaveholder gets compensated. But in Exodus, if somebody hits a male or female servant in the eye and destroys it, that person must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. Knock out the tooth, let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. I had a dentist pull some of my teeth. Anyway, must let them go free to compensate. Notice that the compensation in Exodus goes to the slave instead of the slaveholder. Limits to liability. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned, but the owner of the bull is not held responsible if they don't know. Well, same with Hammurabi. But it's different in the case of negligence. If you know that your bull was in the habit of goring and you don't keep it penned up, then you can be executed too. Now, it's actually harsher in the Old Testament there than in some of the other collections, like in Ishnuna, 2/3 of a mina of silver. But it's inconsistent because if you build a wall and it falls on somebody and kills them, then you'd be put to death for that one. And again, in Hammurabi, it's like 1/2 a mina of silver for negligence with a bull, but death for negligence with a wall. So it's probably a good thing to have rules about negligence. Legal liability is greater for a free person. So the monetary payment is for killing a slave, but death for killing a wife or child in Ishnuna. In Exodus, if payment is demanded of one, one may redeem one's life by paying whatever is demanded. Well, this also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. There are penalties for negligence when the slave is killed. You have that in both, but the penalties are different than if it's a free person. Now, but in the case of Exodus, the owner and the bull are punished. More about negligence in other cases. We won't go into all of them. I'm highlighting some with the slaves because I want to show you where things have moved beyond the Old Testament laws in terms of moving toward God's kingdom ideal. An ox gores another ox. We have the same penalty in many ancient Near Eastern collections. Property ownership. Well, that's assumed also in the ancient Near East that people can own property. It's permissible to kill thieves sometimes. So Ishnuna, a thief caught in the field of the home during the day pays 10 shekels. At night, the thief dies if they're caught breaking in. Hammurabi, the penalties actually are harsher if it's state property, because of course they're the ones who make up the rules. But death for all thieves. Well, I don't see how you can make it harsher. But anyway, in Exodus, you may kill a thief breaking in, but only at night. Because you know if a thief breaks in at night when they expect you're at home, they're ready to kill you. So the idea is self-defense. But even a thief's life is worth more than your property. So if a thief breaks in during the day when you might not be at home, then you're not allowed to kill them. Restitution. Now, this would be a good thing for the victims, certainly, but also for the perpetrators when they're caught today. Rather than just locking them up, they can do something useful in terms of repaying not just what they've taken, but more than what they've taken, where that's possible. Restitution is a good idea, and that was practiced in Exodus. It's also practiced in Ishnuna. Now, obviously, you can't make restitution for everything, like killing somebody, but restitution twofold. Exodus 22:7. If they're stolen, if a thief is caught, the thief must pay double. And we actually see in the case of Zacchaeus being ready to pay back multiple times over. White collar thieves counts too. Laws regarding deposits. So if you leave something with somebody as a deposit and they cheat with it, they lose it. It depends on whether it's an accident, whether it's deliberate theft, whatever. So there are laws regarding deposits. We still have those today, like laws regarding bank deposits. There are other laws on deposits. Losing hired or borrowed animals. If you borrow something, it's different from if it belongs to you yourself or if you steal it. Death for sorcery. Now, actually, you may think that's unique to Israel, but actually, Hammurabi, there's also a problem with sorcery. One who accuses another of sorcery actually gets to confiscate the sorcerer's estate after the latter is executed, which of course gives you incentive to accuse somebody of sorcery. But what happens if they're proved innocent? Well, then you die and they get to take your property. So you better be able to prove it if you're going to accuse somebody of that. But also, some of the ways they determined if somebody was guilty would be things like throwing them into the river. If they float, they're guilty. Well, no, actually, it wasn't quite like that. But anyway, all cultures officially opposed unjust judges and bribery. Now, when they say officially opposed them, it actually was pretty common. But if they're caught, they can be punished pretty severely. In fact, there's a later case. Now, this was a case and not a law that was on anybody's books, so far as any that we found. But there was a judge who was found guilty of taking bribes. And so the king ordered him flayed alive and placed his skin over the back of the judge's seat. And his son, who was to be the next judge, would have to sit in that seat knowing that he was sitting on his father's flayed off skin for taking bribes. Chances are that son would not follow in his father's footsteps in that particular crime. So some laws are very similar to those of surrounding cultures, but some laws oppose contemporary customs. So, for example, the Canaanite god Baal turns into a bull so he could impregnate a cow goddess. Some think, this is not everybody, but some think the Canaanites practiced ritual bestiality. I'm not sure that the evidence for that is completely compelling. But anyway, Exodus, anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. Polytheism obviously is very different in Israel. That was pretty universal elsewhere in the ancient Near East. There's one possible exception in the Old Testament period, Akhenaten in Egypt, and even that wasn't a complete exception. But Exodus, anybody who sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. So that takes us to it shows us something God is very serious about. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying we should actually enforce that in our churches today. We enforce all the death penalties on the books in ancient Israel. We wouldn't have very many people left. But God also prohibits divination, Deuteronomy chapter 18. Divination was practiced throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. You think of the Baru diviners in Mesopotamia. They would cut open a sacrificed animal, see if anything was unusual about the liver, and try to use that to tell the king whether go into battle. The gods are with you, or no, this liver looked a little bit interesting. Let's try another sacrifice. Maybe we can persuade the gods to give us a liver that is more favorable for you going into battle. Romans studied the flights of birds, augury, and so forth. God says you're not allowed to do that. He did allow prophecy. There were prophecies in the ancient Near East as well, but there are some clear differences. But that's, again, for another lesson. So here are a few examples of rules in Leviticus and Numbers. Leviticus 18, incest is not allowed. Well, that was standard practice, not just in the ancient Near East, but nearly all cultures have incest prohibitions. But they vary in scope. So Greeks allowed marriage to paternal half-sisters. Some Egyptians could marry their full sisters. Greeks thought that Persians allowed people to marry their mothers. Now, some of this may be Greek projections on other cultures, I don't know. But some cultures exclude all first cousins. Some cultures say, no, you can marry your cousin. Some cultures distinguish between parallel and cross cousins, like is your mom's cousin? Is it your dad's cousin? Things like that. So there are differences, but certainly Leviticus says no committing of incest. The ancient legal milieu establishes the issues a law code must address, but the biblical answers may differ. So Leviticus chapter 25, throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. Well, in Eshnunna, if a man is hard up and sells their house, the owner of the house will be entitled to redeem it whenever the purchaser resells it. Miss your old house? Hey. But there are no other ancient Near Eastern parallels to the protection of families' land rights by Jubilee. So the Jubilee principle, it honors families, it provides stability in an agrarian society where land was capital and thereby prevents monopolistic accumulation of capital. So there's a transcultural ethic in chapter 25, verse 35. If one of your country people becomes poor and is unable to support himself among you, help that person as you would an alien, an immigrant, or a temporary resident so they can continue to live among you. There's some ritual parallels as well. So in Hammurabi, it talks about don't drink wine if you're a particular ministry position, so to speak. If they do, they burn the person alive. Well, that was true for a priest's daughter, somebody from the priestly line in Israel as well. But Nazarites, in terms of burning them, Nazarites in Numbers chapter 6 must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and so on. Samson ended up violating part of his Nazarite vow and losing his strength. He actually he'd already violated the other parts of it. But that's, again, another story. Note some contrasts among commonalities. Israel's sacrifices included thank offerings, atonement offerings, and sin offerings. Well, Canaanites had all those. And that makes sense. The costly way to show your gratitude to the deity you believe has helped you. Atonement and sin offerings. Well, uh, if I'm punished for this guilt, I'm in big trouble. Let's see if I can transfer it to a substitute. So Israel's sacrifices teach us about those things. Ultimately, we know the true substitute who was sacrificed for us is the Lord Jesus. But, we still want to show our gratitude to God in various ways. The Canaanites, though, although, Israel learned from, well, God showed them in culturally relevant ways, speaking in language they could understand, culturally relevant ways, how to show their trust in God in a costly way. So other cultures have sacrifices for these purposes. You do too. But the other cultures also had sacrifices to make it rain. Whereas God says, Israel, you keep my covenant. You take care of the poor, Deuteronomy 15. I'll send you the rain. Don't try to twist my arm. Just obey me, and I'll send you the rain. Ritual purity laws. What's clean and unclean? What's pure and impure? We think in different terms today, but God gave them something that was intelligible within their culture. For example, the Hittites had ritual purity laws too, but often they were magical prophylaxis to protect them from demons. Israel's purity laws are more like, so you recognize the holiness of God and that God must be approached with awe and reverence. So there's certain things you do in that regard. Food prohibitions. Well, most cultures had certain kinds of food that they would eat or not eat. Certain things, especially for priests, that they would eat or not eat. But from one culture to another, they differed. This was probably partly a way to set Israel apart. So at the end of the list in Leviticus 11, you also have a list in Deuteronomy 14. The end of the list in Leviticus 11, he says, this shows you to be separate from me, from all the nations around you. I am the Lord your God. You're to be holy as I am holy. And whatever the particulars of the food prohibitions, overall what they did, they kept Israel culturally separate so they wouldn't just blend into the cultures around them, which would have religious consequences. Now, today, of course, we're commanded to go out and make disciples of all the nations. So we're in the world, but we're not of the world. And that was also something that the Jewish people had to negotiate as they lived in other cultures, but they did keep to these laws, and it helped preserve them as a distinct people. Deuteronomy's laws. Well, there are about as many parallels as in Exodus. False witnesses. Well, if you charge somebody with a capital crime, then if you're a false witness, you're to be put to death. That's true in the surrounding cultures. That was also true in Israel. And whatever you charge somebody else with, if you're lying, then you get the punishment that they would have gotten if you were telling the truth. Corporate responsibility for bloodshed in our society. So today, sometimes people argue, is the individual guilty or is the society guilty? Well, you find biblical passages that point to both. Obviously, the individual who commits the act is guilty, but there's also a kind of collective responsibility. So, a place could be cursed with blood guilt in ancient Near Eastern thought, and the local government could be responsible for a crime in the ancient Near East. Well, in Deuteronomy 21, we also read about blood guilt and a local government being responsible for crimes the government itself didn't commit. Here's the scenario in this case. If you can't find the person who committed the murder, then the area, the locale, says, okay, God, we didn't commit this. We're not responsible, but it was committed on our ground. We take responsibility for it, and we offer the sacrifice because this is a serious thing. That blood has been shed in our place. Rebellious sons. I'm glad that this is not enforced today because I was a rebellious son before my conversion. And actually, after my conversion, some of my obedience to the Lord was rebellion to some of my household that wasn't happy about it. So, anyway, rebellious sons. In Hammurabi, they may disinherit sons, and only after the second warning and only in extreme cases. In Deuteronomy 21, well, again, it seems like they've been warned multiple times. They're to bring them out and say, okay, well, this person's a glutton and a drunkard, and then the locality puts them to death. You say, whoa, that's too strong. Well, it's certainly not what you have, say, in Ephesians 6:4 with minor children, where it says, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Don't treat them too harshly. But having said that, these things weren't always enforced, but they were part of a culture where they had kind of a general ethos of certain things just don't go. And respect for parents and obedience to parents was a really big thing. Different views on cross-dressing. Transvestitism was practiced in some of the surrounding cultures. Sometimes maybe magical transvestitism. You had it with Hittites sometimes when they would conquer a culture and they would then dress up the men as women, supposedly, apparently, to strip them magically of their masculine potency, because warriors back then were men. So then they couldn't fight anymore. And also you have a sister who's going to avenge her brother, and she dresses up as a man underneath so that she can like have masculine power to fight. Anyway, Deuteronomy 22:5, a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man may wear women's clothing. Now, this has really been quoted out of context a lot in certain traditions in my culture, where, for example, in some churches, more a generation ago probably than today, they said, women can't wear pants. Women's pants aren't like men's pants. But anyway, today, pants are women's clothing just like they're men's clothing. And for that matter, in the ancient Near East, men wore what looked to us like dresses. You know, it depends on the culture. But the point is, don't pretend to be a different gender than what you are. Death for adultery. Now, if an Old Testament scholar corrects you on some of this, keep in mind, I'm not an expert in the sense I haven't studied Ugaritic, Akkadian, all that. I read Hebrew, but the ones who know Ugaritic and Akkadian and stuff like that are more competent than I am and probably more up to date. But I'm giving you the best I can. Again, this is free. So, death for adultery. Well, that's in a lot of cultures. And yeah, that's true in Israel. Death sentence for raping betrothed virgins. If they're betrothed, they're engaged. Now, what happens if they're not betrothed? Well, that's another story. So, the economic character of marriage arrangements. So, in the Shnuna and Hammurabi, you have to make a marriage contract between, with the groom needs to make it with the bride's parents, and there needs to be a financial transaction. Otherwise, you're not married. So very different from a lot of cultures, but it's similar in a lot of other cultures. Deuteronomy, the rapist shall pay the non-betrothed virgin's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl for he's violated her, because in that culture, it may be hard for her to get another husband. Again, that's not good. That somebody would hold that against her. But notice that what she has to pay, what he has to pay, is the marriage settlement for a virgin. She's still treated as a virgin economically. And if she and her family say, I'm not going to marry the guy, well, she's still treated as a moral virgin. He still has to pay what he would have paid for a virgin. Rape was, and actually, in some cases, in rape in the Old Testament, where we have it in the narrative, the brothers avenged it by killing the person, which was not acceptable, but they did take it very seriously. And it's actually something that comes out of these cultures as opposed to some other cultures that treat rape more lightly. These cultures treated it seriously, and Israelite culture treated it more seriously than other cultures have. Let me just, because I haven't gotten yet to the principles and how you extrapolate the principles from these things. Returning slaves to the slaveholders, as I mentioned, Eshnuna, anyone caught with a stolen slave shall return them. If even an official holds them as much as 1 week, he may be prosecuted for theft. Hammurabi, the penalty for harboring an escaped slave is death. But Deuteronomy, if a slave has taken refuge with you, don't hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Don't oppress them. Laws and cult prostitutes. Well, in Hammurabi, hey, it's allowed. Deuteronomy and Leviticus, no way. It's absolutely off limits. Rules for divorce. It's actually more strongly opposed in Ishnuna and Hammurabi than it is in Deuteronomy. But of course, Jesus tightens that in the New Testament. Familial responsibility. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children be put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for their own sin. You say, why does Deuteronomy have to specify that? Well, look at what some of the surrounding cultures specify. If a man killed another's daughter, they execute his daughter. If a house collapses and kills the owner's son, the builder's son gets executed. So there are corporate effects of sin in Deuteronomy, but the person who's put to death is the person who commits the act, not a member of their family. So, how do we understand and apply God's law today? Especially keeping in mind that God originally gave these laws in an ancient Near Eastern setting to an ancient Near Eastern people addressing a different legal milieu than today. Well, for that, we're going to need to look at some of the principles in the Torah and also how those principles are extrapolated in the prophets, and especially in our case, we're going to look at the New Testament. So that will be the video that I'll make immediately after this one.